And he realized, and he asked himself, well, where do I get my beliefs in human equality and dignity and value and progress and freedom? And he realized they didn't come from the Greeks and the Romans. They had a completely different set of moral values and assumptions to him. And they didn't come from science and reason either. He realized they came from Christianity, and that even though he struggled to believe in, if you like, the supernatural claims of Christianity, as he put it to me, he's realized that in almost every other way, Justin, I am a Christian, in terms of my assumptions about what it means to be human.
So I recently had the chance to interview Justin Brierley. Justin is an author and broadcaster who has interviewed many of the top minds on the subjects of faith, science, theology, and culture. He has specialized in hosting discussions and debates featuring people like Jordan Peterson, Richard Dawkins, Steven Pinker, Douglas Murray, and many other household names on the wildly popular UK radio show and podcast, Unbelievable. His most recent work has been centered on a new podcast and his book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. Justin was someone I began following years ago and whose show had a big impact on me, so I highly recommend getting a copy of his book and following Justin's podcast. The link to both can be found in the video description. Anyway, it was a real pleasure having this interview with Justin, and I hope you all enjoy it. So you've written the book. The title of the book is The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and the subtitle is Why the New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. There's the book, right?
There it is.
And,
just holding it up for camera.
and I do have it here, everyone, on screen, and I will be putting a link to this, obviously, in the video description, because I do want you all to go out and buy Justin's book for sure. So with that in mind, the subtitle, Why the New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. Now, for those who might not be familiar with what you mean by the new atheism, do you want to give people a little bit of understanding of what that is?
Yeah, New Atheism was really a very aggressive form of atheism that developed in the mid-2000s and was characterized by certain secular intellectuals and scientists who sort of led this movement. People like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett. These were the so-called four horsemen of New Atheism. They were a bunch of kind of scientists, philosophers, intellectuals. Each had their own best-selling anti-God book, perhaps most famously Richard Dawkins with The God Delusion, which sold millions of copies around the world. Mm-hmm. And for a good time, these were very influential, people who had many column inches were, being featured on TV, radio. There were atheist conferences popping up all over the world. So this was a big deal. Here in the UK, we had something called the Atheist Bus Campaign, where red London buses were circulating the capital, emblazoned with the logo, "There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life." So it was a kind of, it was a big deal. And over in the US, you had probably the high watermark of it was the Reason Rally, which I think it was in 2012 in Washington, DC, thousands and thousands of atheists descending on the Capitol to kind of campaign for science and reason and to sort of militate against religion, basically. And it was an interesting time, as I say, from the sort of mid 2000s to early 2010s, when this movement really was very central to the conversation on faith. And that was very much where my show, began, hosting these kinds of conversations between these new atheist type characters and Christian thinkers. And in a way, it was very interesting and enlightening and invigorating, because these were quite dramatic sort of debates. But often they were characterized by more heat than light, because inevitably some of the atheists, who were in this new atheist camp were quite dismissive, resorted more to ridicule than reason when it came to their approach to religion. So it could be frustrating in that way. And I think a lot of people of faith did find that quite frustrating. So that was the movement. It was, as I say, it rose very quickly, became very popular. But I say in the book, and also in the podcast series that now accompanies the book of the same name, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, there was also this waning of new atheism, which happened almost as quickly. It sort of sputtered out quite quickly, and there were all kinds of interesting behind the scenes infighting that happened within the new atheist movement that led to its internal unraveling. But more than that, I think just at a cultural level, it sort of lost its sheen, because a lot of people, I think, started to see it as just as fundamentalist in its own way as the religion it was attacking. It was, somewhat shallow, actually, in its critique of religion. And I think in the end, it didn't actually offer answers to people. Science and reason are good for some things, but they're not the kind of tools you can use to build a meaningful life, really. And so I think it ultimately didn't answer people's existential questions around meaning and purpose and identity. And that's the fundamental reason why I think new atheism sort of sputtered out in the end, as alongside these internal issues that it experienced.
Yeah, and it's funny, as we were talking earlier, I had kind of a front row seat to this. I feel like one of the reasons that I found both your show appealing, and I've been watching it for many years now, one of the sort of original shows that I even have recommended to a lot of other people, is watching the development of this. Because my brother ended up reading The God Delusion and kind of got into that new atheist sort of camp, left our faith, and it was interesting because I then was confronted with these questions, and it was shows like yours that I would watch. And it was interesting to see, just as you pointed out, I came to the exact same conclusions. I said, their critique of religion isn't as sharp as a lot of people think. There's a lot more bluster here, that like, we're the smart kids, all these religious morons are out there just, embracing these wild traditions. And then I'd watch your show and I was like, wait a minute. There are some absolutely brilliant Christians, and the Christian tradition has a long intellectual tradition that is worthy of immense respect, not only especially, as you said, in these areas of deeper meaning, of the real fundamental questions. And it was also interesting just for me to realize that conversation existed, that Western civilization even, and then Christianity specifically, there's been this, like, the big questions have been big questions for a long time.
Yeah.
And so as it came across and it began to fail, it's funny, you said, though, in your book, there was a really great line that I loved. Your section is titled, "Thank God for Richard Dawkins." What did you want to explain what you meant by that?
Sure. Just really that actually, I think the new atheism, as much as it did sort of get a number of converts to its cause, as it were, people who lost their faith, perhaps rather like your brother, at the same time, I think it did some good things for the Christian church, especially. It caused the Christian church to sort of actually re-engage its apologetic and intellectual and theological kind of foundations. I think to a degree, large parts of the church had become kind of rather emotionally driven, and there's nothing wrong with emotion, I think, in worship. It's just that if that's all you've got, I think that can be problematic. And it did force us to pick up those theology and apologetics books again. And it led to the flourishing of some wonderful ministries, because there was this sort of urgent need to address the objections of these new atheists. You had the flowering of ministries like William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith Ministry, or Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire, or many other sort of, ministries, including, The Unbelievable Show. I think, honestly, that the success of The Unbelievable Show, as it stood from those mid-2000s onwards, was because it had the new atheism to contend with it. That was a great foil, to what we were doing.
I'll raise my hand. I'm one of those shows.
Yeah, exactly.
I started my channel largely to talk with people about my experience of learning about this largely deeper tradition that I never knew about, that I only discovered because Richard Dawkins decided to go out there and throw a hard punch at Christianity. Yeah. And so it's been, really cool.
And the irony of it is that I know a number of people who are now Christians because they actually bumped into the new atheism, ironically. And so it's interesting to see how, in God's providence, even Richard Dawkins can end up being a kind of a great evangelist in that sense. I've got someone I work with very closely now, a guy called Peter, who, sort of had a faith that he lost by the time he got to university, and very much became an atheist, didn't really want to know about Christianity. And he started to get into the new atheists and read their books and watch their lectures and so on. And it was good. He felt this had confirmed his decision to just, leave Christianity behind. But it was then the process of both having some housemates, one of whom became a very kind of, evangelical Christian, and one who became an atheist, that he sort of had to confront this question. Well, what does this mean? And his watching the lectures and reading the books of the new atheists led him to then investigating the other side. And he started to watch some of these well-known apologists, people like John Lennox and William Lane Craig and others. And that led him to the Unbelievable Show as well. In fact, I featured him on the show while he was still in his sort of agnostic phase. But eventually, he found that he had become persuaded, both at a intellectual but also at a personal level, that Christianity was true. So he had this extraordinary sort of journey, from essentially atheism and new atheism. But because of his engagement with those characters, he was introduced to Christian apologetics and realized, actually, these guys have more sensible things to say than I anticipated. And they're certainly not the dim-witted, delusional half-wits that the new atheists painted Christians to be. So, and in that sense, I even felt there was a win when I had atheists who listened to the show and said, well, look, I've not been convinced, Justin, but I have more respect than I had for Christians than when I began listening. That for me is a win. If you move the dial even a little, I think there's something God can do with that. So
absolutely. And I like that you talked about sort of this idea of the emotions and also the intellect. And in my mind, there's sort of the head and the heart, right? And you're absolutely right. And I think even in my own tradition, there has been this sort of focus on the heart, and then to bring in and show that, no, intellectually, this is a respectable worldview. And in fact, a more powerful worldview than theirs on a litany of important questions is a big deal. But I also think that people need to be cautious a little bit, because I think that the world of apologetics and this world of sort of the intellect and the head, our faith isn't just about that. It's about the whole person, right? And so not to just be intellectually like, okay, this intellectually is something that I aspire to, but it's like, it's an experience that you've had with God that ultimately can drive people. And I think that, but like you said, Richard Dawkins and them, they helped us sort of get out of just heart mode. And as you said in the book, and I love this line, you said, he got us to put down our guitars and pick up our philosophy books, which I loved. Now, another critique that a lot of people have had of the new atheism movement that has kind of led to its downfall is its own sort of religiosity, because there's sort of this idea that the atheists will say, well, it's just a lack of belief in God. But, what do you mean by when this idea that atheism became religious?
Yeah. Well, I bumped into that sort of claim plenty of times over the years myself, that atheism is just lack of belief in God. But I don't think that's true, because if you simply applied that definition to our world, then rocks are atheists and cats are atheists. It makes it a bit meaningless. This idea is atheism is just a lack of belief in God. The vast majority of the atheists I met had a belief that there is no God. Okay, so it's a positive belief. It's not just this supposed lack of belief. So I think atheists should be a bit more honest, if to say, look, there's a truth claim here. It's not just this kind of, I just happen to not have this particular belief, or whatever it might be. And I think what's important about that is that actually with the new atheism especially, it went even further than that. There were a whole set of things that new atheists were kind of promoting and kind of very much putting forward as their if you like, almost a quasi-religious set of statements or doctrines. Essentially, if there was a creed for the new atheists, it was scientific materialism, that all that exists is matter in motion, the laws of nature. Everything can ultimately be reduced to these things. All our beliefs, all of our values, all of every explanation really can be ultimately reduced to science and nature as it's as the ultimate explanatory framework. So there was this creed, and in a funny way, you know, anyone, even atheists, who diverge from this creed was rounded upon as a heretic. So, for instance, Thomas Nagel, the atheist philosopher, when he started to talk in books like Mind and Cosmos about there being some kind of teleology or purpose within the universe, that was, you know, absolutely heresy to the new atheists. They rounded on him because he was diverging from this materialist orthodoxy where there cannot be any purpose or meaning or directionality in the universe. It has to all be purely chance, you know. And it was so interesting because, you know, at one level, atheism doesn't have to entail that, but this was very much the kind of the drum that the new atheists were banging, that it's all, you know, meaningless. Essentially, that's, you kind of have to kind of accept that. And likewise, a lot of the gatherings, you know, started to take on an almost religious fervor. You know, these atheist conferences that took place, it felt like their object of worship was science. You know, this was going to be the great savior of humankind. If we would only just put our trust in science, then it would lead us into this bright utopian future. Again, I think that was an extremely naive view, but that was sort of what was being championed at the time. And you know, you could even say that the high priests of the movement were these four horsemen: Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and Christopher Hitchens, and they had their holy texts, you know, the books they had written and so on, which were almost revered, you know. By I interviewed the theologian Alistair McGrath, who recounted sort of at the time that the God delusion was, you know, at the height of its fame, going into the Waterstones in Oxford to give a lecture. And the person telling him, we had Richard Dawkins in here last week, and people were taking away these God delusion books and holding them to their chest and kind of, you know, treating them like these sacred talismans. And so I do think in all kinds of interesting ways, there was this kind of quasi-religious fervor to the new atheism, which is kind of understandable actually, because I think in you know, one of the claims I make really throughout the book and the podcast series is that we're actually even in a very post-Christian age in the West, we're not actually any less religious than we ever used to be. We just get religious about different things. We will swap one religious story for another kind of religious story. And it may not be a story we think has God in it, but there's certainly something that functions in the place of God in every story. And so for me, that's true of atheism. It's true of politics. It's true of all kinds of ideologies that people kind of turn to in the absence of the true story, the God story, if you like.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that. I have a, and I don't think I made this up. I think this is out there somewhere, but matters of ultimate concern, okay, is really what religion, quote unquote, is all about. Okay, it's the narratives that human beings have around matters of ultimate concern, and there's no doubt that the new atheism was trying to engage with matters of ultimate concern, such as what are we as human beings? And they didn't shy away from answering that question in the affirmative, right? Yeah. So this lack of belief in God, it's like, no, you're making claims about the nature of what it is to be a human being. And other aspects of this sort of matters of ultimate concern. And like you said, science becomes this sort of all-consuming doctrine that can explain everything. And science itself, it's funny though too, because people set up then it's sort of the science against religion, that false dichotomy, right? And I was very surprised as I watched your show and saw the other thinkers and the total straw man of sort of the Christian view of science, because they want to frame it as this science versus religion sort of dichotomy. Now, obviously, you disagree with that. You want to talk a little bit about the relationship between science and religious faith?
For sure. Something, again, we covered many times on the Unbelievable show, and again, devote basically a whole chapter of the book and a whole section of the podcast series to it in The Surprising Rebirth. But yeah, I mean, science was sort of used as a battering ram against religion by the new atheists, partly because a number of the new atheists were scientists, and they had sort of, you know, gotten hold of this, again, I think rather naive idea that that basically the only way to understand the world is through scientific means, and that this is a foolproof way of coming to true conclusions about the world. It to give it a label, it's scientism. It's not just science, because of course there have been generations of Christians who've been perfectly happy to do science and found science extremely useful for all
Science,
kinds of
science
yeah.
emerged through the Christian
Well,
world.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. The all of the pioneers of the scientific revolution, the 16th and 17th century, were Christians. It's just a fact. And the historians of science will tell you it wasn't just a coincidence that the scientific revolution emerged in Western Christian culture. It was very much because of Western Christian culture that the scientific revolution happened, because the idea of the Christian story gave scientists a reason to go out and explore the universe and expect to find an ordered universe, which was set in motion by an ordered lawgiver, God. That assumption just wasn't there in any other culture, and that's why the historians will tell you the scientific, other cultures had kind of precursors to sort of what you would call modern science, but they never went full throttle and started a scientific revolution based on this idea of experimentation and falsification. This was something that was specifically birthed because of their Christian beliefs, interestingly. So this whole claim by the new atheists that science and faith are at odds to each other is absolutely spurious from the get-go, because it was Christians who were the first scientists. I mean, the irony of this came home when I had a well-known atheist scientist called Peter. Oh, his surname's got in my head. Peter Atkins. Peter Atkins.
Yes.
Very sort of snarky,
aggressive,
rather aggressive, rather rude chemist from Oxford. Well known for sort of being a bit of a pantomime character almost in that way. Anyway, he'd written a book sort of about why he believes you can have a universe from nothing, basically. And he, and it was, very, as usual, very snide, very snarky about religion and so on. The irony was he'd used a quote on the very first page by Francis Bacon about the scientific method. Francis Bacon was the most devout Christian you will ever find. He was the father of the scientific method. And it just struck me so ironic that he would use a quote from Francis Bacon to start this book trying to claim that God has absolutely no place in the scientific world. Anyway, that's a bit of an aside. The point is, yes, science there's been a long history there, but also, when I've put this to some of the new atheist types, they would say, well, maybe that was how it got going, but we've certainly kind of dispensed with God now that we know how the universe works. And that's been the kind of the real driver of the new atheist sort of message, was the more we know about the universe, the more we understand things scientifically, the less need we have for God. And again, I just think this is a category error on the part of the new atheists, because the reality is, yes, there are some things that science is very good at telling us, but there are lots of things that it won't tell us. It can tell you what you are made of, but it won't tell you what your value is, because that's not a scientific question. It can tell you perhaps some of the processes by which the universe came into being, but it won't tell you why it's here. And there's so you just have to accept there are some things that science is good for kind of describing and explaining, and there are other things that it's just the wrong tool to be using for that. And I think the new atheists had this very kind of again, naive approach, thinking that it could answer all of those questions. And when it didn't, and I sort of sometimes put this to people like Lawrence Krauss, but what about the why questions? He would say, well, that's not a valid question. That's, if it doesn't fit within a scientific rubric, it's not a valid question. That's just, that just is ridiculous. So, and even if you do science, this is the irony of the whole thing. The best science these days is opening up the God question, not closing it down. If you look at the advances we've had in the last several decades around the fact that we see this extraordinary fine-tuning of the universe for the emergence of life, it seems to speak of something beyond itself. When you look at the fact we have a universe, the Big Bang cosmology, that it was involved in anything existing at all, again, it opens up huge questions about where that came from. When you look at the complexity of life in its initial phases, the first self-replicating DNA molecule. It's very hard to explain that on a purely naturalistic basis. The odds are just so stacked against these things. So the God question is constantly, I think, being opened up actually by the best science rather than being closed down. And if you'll forgive me this very long answer, the fact we can even do science is itself points beyond itself, because lots of physicists have kind of marveled and sort of shaken their head in wonder at the fact that the universe is written in the language of mathematics and can be explored by our finite human brains. That itself seems to be a remarkable piece of good fortune, if there's no mind behind it, basically, that we happen to be able to explore the whole of our universe using this completely separate language of mathematics, and yet the whole universe is conformed to this language of mathematics that just is there waiting to be discovered. So this is why when I've interviewed people even like Roger Penrose, who's not a Christian and probably describes himself as an atheist, and yet he's not a new atheist, because he says, no, something funny is going on in the universe. The fact that we have this realm of mathematics that just exists, and that it maps onto the physical realm, and that we can access it mentally, this mental realm. He says there's not just one sort of realm of nature, which is what the new atheists say. He says there's also a mental realm. There's also a kind of mathematical sort of abstract realm. And so a lot of, it's a far more complex and interesting picture than the new atheist painted, basically. Science itself throws up all kinds of questions, which I think find their answer actually in God.
Yeah. And it's funny that you mentioned like mathematics and the ordered nature of the universe, because that in and of itself is a weird thing. And specifically, what was interesting is this: you brought up sort of Christianity and its specific tie to science, and I would say even maybe a broader monotheistic tradition that has a basis of God in law. The idea is that, as I've studied this out, when you look at sort of pagan religions, the universe is chaotic. And essentially in this chaos, you're going to the gods saying like, help me out within the chaos. Whereas the Christian tradition, and sort of, I would even say maybe the more Judeo-Christian tradition that emerges, it has this idea of an order in the universe that's established, like a law-based order to the universe. And that changes the game. And a lot of people don't realize that, because that means that there are discoverable laws. It isn't chaos and you just make your sacrifice to whatever god and hope that fate is in your favor, as the old pagans did. But instead, it says there is a law given by a lawgiver that can be discovered. And so the orientation of science sort of takes that for granted as a presupposition to begin the exploration of the universe, expecting to find law, which, if you look historically at Christianity, that's exactly what happened. As I think it was John Lennox says all the time, they expected to find, because they believed in a lawgiver, they believed that the laws were discoverable. And that's exactly what they found.
Yeah.
Which is
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would even sort of say, that's there from page 1 of the Bible, even the creation account, which, many new atheists will scoff at as this sort of Bronze Age thinking or whatever. But actually, when you go and read it, it's extraordinary in the way it does unfold things in a very specific kind of symbolic way in the Genesis account. And there's this sense of emptiness being filled in each of the creation days. And there's just a sense of, as you say, order and purpose that's there from page 1, which is very different to the other pagan religions, which were far more about this idea of things that were already there, the gods kind of taking and remolding and or whatever. Whereas you very much get this sense that the book of the beginning of Genesis, it's saying, well, the first thing that was there was God, and God created, God spoke things into existence. And then if you go to the Gospel of John, where Jesus is sort of then this kind of this way in which he takes that Genesis passage and applies it to Jesus as the Logos, the divine word. And I love the fact that Logos itself speaks of logic and law, and the Greek word really is about bringing order out of chaos and meaning out of non-meaning and life out of non-life. And that's really what you're seeing in science, actually. There's this, Paul Davies, another sort of well-known kind of agnostic scientist who I've talked to about this, really does, when he's describing what's going on in the universe, he's describing this logos, the kind of directionality in the direction of meaning and purpose and order and life and consciousness and comprehension. He adds that, that there's something going on in the universe. And I just think it perfectly maps onto this idea of the logos behind life, which is right there in scripture and right there in science. So for me, it's very complementary in that way.
And now I can hear my atheist brother or brothers, a couple of brothers that are atheists, and them saying right now, this is just God of the gaps thinking. Science runs into something that it can't quite explain yet, and therefore you're just, if you don't know, you just say God. What's your response to people who have that sort of a criticism of this?
I agree there are some forms of argument that are God of the gaps thinking. So I don't think they're wrong to say we should be wary of that, and we should, because where there are valid physical explanations for things, we should seek to find the valid physical explanations for things. But the fact is, with these kinds of questions, this isn't, I'd say there's a difference. There's good gaps and there's bad gaps. Okay. The bad gaps are the ones where you just insert God into something that will eventually just be explained by a physical process. Fair enough. The good gaps, in a sense, are the ones that are intrinsically not fillable by a physical process, because they're gaps to do with purpose. They're gaps to do with something that goes beyond physical stuff. It's a bit like, there's a difference. If I said, why is the kettle boiling? You could give me a physical explanation. The heating element is exciting the water molecules and bringing them to a state of, where they can escape into a gaseous form. Okay, good physical scientific explanation for why is the water boiling. Another explanation I could give you is that I wanted to make a cup of tea. Now, those are both perfectly valid explanations. It's just one is a physical explanation and one is an explanation to do with purpose and meaning. And science is the right thing for one, but science isn't the way to understand the other one. And so it's perfectly, you have to move beyond science at that point. Science isn't the thing that will do it. So these are gaps that God is a perfectly appropriate answer for. There are some kinds of questions that need God-sized answers, basically. Science isn't the toolkit to go to work on those ones.
Yeah, and it's funny, that was, so even on the scientific level, I'm a big fan of Stephen Meyer's work. Been following him again for well over a decade. And even within science, there's the question of how can science detect sort of intention and intelligent design, right? Because it's funny, because we do that. we archaeology, like, that's the reason that we know that some things are created by intelligent agents, where other things are just happen by natural forces. And the same goes for the SETI program, where they search for extraterrestrial life by looking for certain patterns and specified complexity and these sorts of things. And it was interesting to see that even within the realm of science, there are ways that you can scientifically go about trying to detect things like intelligent design. But then, as you said, there are questions that fall totally outside of it. I think people, they just don't realize the complexity of the questions that we're running into, and that while the scientific method and the study of the natural stuff of the world, it can only go so far until you say, okay, it can explain these other things. But those other things, like you said, they're just a different category entirely.
Yeah.
And
I agree totally with what you're saying there. That I think the problem sometimes is that as much as some atheists or scientists accuse the Christian thinker of a God of the gaps approach, it's just as easy to fall into a sort of materialism of the gaps as well, which is that the only explanations on the table that are allowed are these physical explanations. And that's just an unwarranted presupposition that that person is bringing in to bear. If the idea of agency or design is somehow off the table, you're not allowed to introduce that, then you've kind of just decided that materialism is the only thing that will ever fill any of these gaps. And the fact, you need to justify that. Okay. If actually all the evidence leads you to infer that some sort of design is happening, there's some kind of agency going on in the system, whatever, then why shouldn't you sort of infer that? Because we do that all the time in every other aspect of life. Why is science suddenly this one place where only material answers are allowed?
In areas of science, philosophy, and various others, there's been a real change in the conversation here. All of a sudden, the new atheism is sort of being recognized, I think, as not as deep as a lot of people thought. And you talk about this new tone in the conversation because you're talking with top intellects in their various fields. And where I think if you went back maybe to 2010, 2012, there was a much more dismissive sort of attitude amongst the intelligentsia in the West towards religion. And now all of a sudden, and I noticed it on your show, there was like a change where all of a sudden more and more people were like, actually, maybe there's more to this. Tell me a little more about that sort of change in the tone and conversation that you've observed over the last decade or so.
Yeah, well, this is really, at the center of the book, The Surprising Rebirth, The Belief in God, and the podcast series, because I did start to see that as more and more non-Christians were distancing themselves from this new atheist movement, there was also this rise of an interesting breed of new secular intellectual who weren't necessarily Christians, but who weren't dismissing Christianity. And they weren't satisfied basically with the new atheist approach to just sort of dismissing and ridiculing faith. And I started to notice a number of these characters start to get, a lot of mainstream appeal, have big audiences. So the obvious examples are people like Jordan Peterson, the Canadian psychologist who suddenly sort of rose to fame in 2017, 2018. And when I brought him on my show, you would have been forgiven for thinking was, the Christian apologist in the conversation when I put him in a conversation with Susan Blackmore, an atheist psychologist, because they were debating, do we need God to make sense of life, basically? And Peterson was essentially arguing, yes, we do. Even though when I asked him, well, do you believe in God? He said, well, it's complicated. It depends what you mean by God. So I was seeing the rise of these kind of, people who were suddenly, had huge influence. Peterson, drawing thousands of people to his lectures of all things, the book of Genesis.
Yeah.
Huge YouTube and podcast platform in due course. And I think, what I surmised was happening was that a lot of the people who had been turning up for the new atheists, they'd kind of been let down, I think, by the answers. They weren't actually answering their existential questions. And what Peterson was doing was he was appealing to people's sort of search for meaning and purpose and value and identity. And interestingly, where he was pointing them was not to science and reason, not that he was against science and reason. I think that was part of his appeal. He kind of took a somewhat sort of scientific approach to things, but he was pointing them back to scripture, to Christianity as the source of their meaning and their purpose and their identity. And he wasn't alone. I was seeing other people kind of, again, not Christians necessarily, but sort of just talking about the value of Christianity. Not necessarily that it was true, but that certainly it had incredible social effects and good social effects. So another obvious example is Tom Holland, the historian, not the Spider-Man actor. And Tom Holland, someone I've had the privilege of having numerous interviews with over the last few years. Now co-host of the most popular history podcast in the world, The Rest is History. He wrote this best-selling book, Dominion, in 2019, in which he essentially outlined his own journey to some extent of having been a secular historian who began writing books on the Roman and Greek empires. But the more time he spent in the sandals of the Romans and the Greeks, the more he realized how very alien their world was to his own in terms of especially their values. A world where slavery was just a de facto part of the economy, where the lives of women and children were cheap, where some people could be the sexual property of other people. And he realized, and he asked himself, well, where do I get my beliefs in human equality and dignity and value and progress and freedom? And he realized they didn't come from the Greeks and the Romans. They had a completely different set of moral values and assumptions to him. And they didn't come from science and reason either. He realized they came from Christianity, and that even though he struggled to believe in, if you like, the supernatural claims of Christianity, as he put it to me, he's realized that in almost every other way, Justin, I am a Christian, in terms of my assumptions about what it means to be human. And so he's just been one of these fascinating characters who's really been, reminding his secular audience about where their values came from. And I, again, had the opportunity to put him in a debate or two during the time that I was hosting the Unbelievable show. And alongside him have been a number of other interesting, other influential people in social media elsewhere who are talking in such different terms about Christianity and sort of opening the door, I think, for formerly atheistic secular people to consider Christianity again as an intellectual option. And I've met so many, especially of young men, who are now finding themselves attracted to Christianity because it turns out it can make sense. It can make sense of history. It can make sense psychologically. I think the only thing that's remaining for a lot of these, interesting influences is it true in the end? Is it not
Yep.
just a sort of useful fiction? Is it more than that? And I think a lot of people are deciding it is more than that. They're kind of realizing that the stories they have been living on have kind of run out of steam in the West, and that they're kind of turning back and looking at the Christian story again. So despite all of the statistics we have about the decline of religion in the West, the decline in church going, all of which is true, I think there's something happening. The way I put it in the book and the podcast series is that there's a turning of the tide, basically. And even though we're not seeing our churches, full in that sense with these people coming back, I think the tone of the conversation has changed quite dramatically. And I'm just starting to see people starting to take Christianity seriously in a way that they weren't under the, in the era of the new atheist.
Yeah, and I've noticed the exact same thing. In fact, it was just a few years ago that I started to, and I even started posting it in my own social media. I was like, I noticed things would pop up and I'd see things and I was like, something's changing here. This conversation is different. And the moment, there are a few moments that really did it for me that I said something is different. And the first one was the conversation between Jordan Peterson and one of the four horsemen of the new atheism, Sam Harris. I think that is a watershed cultural moment where something changed. I think it represented the moment that tide changed. Because here you had one of the four horsemen of the new atheism. And I think by that time, there was already a lot of dissatisfaction with the new atheism and a lot of questions about it. And all of a sudden, here's Jordan Peterson in there. And he walks away from the conversation and everyone looks at it and goes, of those two guys, Jordan is the one that I sort of is asking the bigger question and maybe providing the bigger answers that are more meaningful here. And then I want to say, and then I think it was on Easter weekend that it happened. I posted it and I said, we officially just witnessed the death of the new atheism. And that was when Richard Dawkins went on, I think it might have been the BBC or some program, and he claimed to be a cultural Christian. And I was like, what did I just witness? Like, what is going on here? And so I think you're exactly right. While we're seeing it's not like the churches are just like filling up with people. Something has happened amongst the sort of the influencer class to where Christianity is suddenly something that's being taken seriously again. But this is where I think a lot of people are at. And including my brother, who I'd asked him, what should I ask Justin? And he said, one of the things he wanted me to ask you about was, but are these people turning back towards Christianity? Because you have people out there like Hirsi Ali or others that people seriously doubt if they are really becoming Christian or if they're just kind of do they actually believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead and is the, savior of the world and will redeem us from our sins and all of the doctrinal sort of things that come along with Christianity? Or are they just sort of moving back and saying, hey, this is a useful fiction? I mean, is this a rebirth of Christianity? Is it just a rebirth of a general belief in a higher power? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I appreciate your brother asking it. And I've been asked the same question many times as I've hosted this documentary series, especially because we've covered people like Hirsi Ali, and it's a super interesting sort of example because I wrote the book, came out in September 2023. Then 2 months later, this story of Hirsi Ali's conversion comes out, and just for those who aren't familiar with the brief thumbnail sketch, she was Somali-born woman, escaped fundamentalist Islam, came to the West, completely put religion behind her, wrote her own sort of best-selling anti-God book, Infidel, very much became part of the new atheist speaking circuit, best friends with Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and and continues in that mold for some time until, as I say, November last year, writes this viral article titled "Why I Am Now a Christian," and it almost completely summarized what I'd just written in the book in some ways, because she was basically saying, I realized that secular humanism, atheism, just wasn't going to work out in the world. It's not a satisfactory enough story to guard against what she sees as the dangers of Putin's Russia, China, fundamentalist Islam, woke ideology on the left. She sees it cannot provide a story that makes sense for people in the way that the Christian story has historically. So she kind of, at an intellectual kind of cultural level, was converted by the Tom Holland thesis, basically. That's where actually these values and ideas come from in the first place, and we need that story to make sense of them. A lot of people said, well, this is just Hirsi Ali adopting a useful fiction kind of approach, but actually I don't think that's true, because even in the article she talked about the fact that she had realized that she needed more than the atheist worldview, and I don't think it was just a higher power that she was kind of appealing to, because she has spoke very candidly in some interviews since about the way in which this personal journey she went on, feeling very depressed, nihilistic, alcoholic, eventually turning to a counselor who said, have you thought about praying? And she said, well, I can't pray. I don't believe in God. The God I was raised with was a monster. And this counselor said, well, what kind of a God, if you could believe in God, do you think you could believe in? And Hirsi Ali says, as she started to describe that God, she realized she was describing Jesus Christ. And so she thought, well, maybe I shouldn't try to invent a new God. Maybe I should investigate this person who claimed to be God. And so she started going to church and she started praying, and she says it's completely turned her life around. Now, I don't know exactly where she is on the Christian journey, but I do know that it's a journey that is definitely involves Christ at the center of it. And I think she was able to persuade Richard Dawkins even of that, because when they had their onstage discussion in New York earlier this year, he sort of went in trying to prove to her, you're not really a Christian, Ian. You don't really believe this stuff about Jesus dying for our sins and resurrecting and this sort of thing. And she very plainly told him, no, I do believe it. Maybe I'm kind of choosing to believe it at this point. But I believe it, that it's the story that I've decided best makes sense of life. And so he admitted, well, look, I came here to disprove that, but I disagree with you, but I think you are actually a Christian. So I would encourage, anyone who doubts her particular story to just sort of, take a leaf out of Richard Dawkins' book. I think if someone says this is what they believe, take that at face value. Having said all that, I think there are other actors in this whole thing who are these people who are very sympathetic, talking very nicely about Christianity, the value of it and so on, but absolutely who don't believe in it. And that's absolutely clear. People like perhaps Douglas Murray might be a good example. Someone who, in conversation with me has described himself as a Christian atheist. He doesn't believe in the supernatural claims of Christianity, but he completely sees the way, in that Tom Holland way, that he's been shaped by the Christian story. And so, at some level, he's somewhere in between. He would like it to be true, I think. He said that much, but he just hasn't found the key that has led him to actually not just see its value, but also to see it as true. I think there are other people who are more cynically involved, want to kind of just use this as a sort of political tool to kind of try and recover some kind of version of Christendom that they think was actually good for us. So I think there's a lot of different people at different points on the spectrum, but I think there are some people who are genuinely have leapt in and they've kind of embraced the Christian story. I think there are people teetering on the edge. That might include people like Tom Holland, who absolutely recognize, obviously, the value of Christianity and are incredibly attracted to it as well, and go to church and say, you know, there are times when I absolutely could say, yes, I believe the whole thing, and other times when a wave of skepticism comes over me, and I think don't be so daft. But certainly, I'd say people like Tom Holland are perhaps not that unusual in the sense that most Christians I know, it's not kind of constant certainty. There's always waves of doubt, and that to some extent is part of the life of faith. But I would say, yeah, it's a spectrum. So I'm not saying that there's no truth in what your brother is suggesting in that question, but I think that there's actually a lot of people who have dived in and they're converting to full-bodied Christianity, because they see actually this makes sense in the end.
Well, and I think it's interesting. Jordan Peterson talks a lot about this idea of religious is what you act out. The idea that at some point in your life, when dealing with matters of ultimate concern, you place your faith, your trust into some narrative about it, whether that's atheistic materialism. And there's almost a question when he posed that question, that was one of the things that I was like, he said in his very Jordan Peterson, like, what the hell do you know about what you actually believe? And I was like, that's a weird question, because it's almost like you discover, well, where have I actually placed my faith? And to some degree, I think there's a discovery in some of us that we realize that I've been placing my faith in the Christian story all along, in the way that I act in the world. And so one of the things, though, that again, my brother had asked, and I thought it was a great question, in this sort of new agey, sort of vague spiritualism that people will label as Christian, maybe without all the doctrine and things, is that sufficient to get the benefits and to fix the issues that Christianity is set to address? Do these new age believers, do they have the grit to do what our forebears as Christians have done? Would Jordan Peterson die for his belief in God? Like, there's a question about the utility of sort of this more vague spiritualism, cultural Christianity. Does it require for us for these people to be fully, church attending Christians to really to get what Christianity is trying to do? Like, does it, I guess in a way, does it matter that these people believe in the way that they do? If is it sufficient?
Yes. Another great question. I would say it's not in the end, because if the folk we're talking about are kind of the folk who kind of are interested in its usefulness to our culture, and they're sort of not too worried about ultimately whether it's really true or not. The problem with that, which again, Hirsi Ali has pointed out, is that it's the question of whether you can retain these fruits of Western culture without the roots, without the story that kind of, and if you're just trying to kind of insist on a sort of, let's just embrace the values, well, the values have to have a source. They have to have something that fires them. Otherwise they will just wither on the vine. And I think more and more people are realizing that, that you're not going to retain them without the true Christian story. The only reason we have these values, the reason we have, education, healthcare, compassion, and everything else in our culture, is because there were people who genuinely believed in these values because of the person of Jesus Christ that had inspired them to go out and live this way in the world. And you won't be able to replicate that just sort of living on the fumes of that story, that without it being sort of really present in the culture any longer, or personally in people's lives. So yeah, I would agree. I don't think you will get that. I don't think, and I think it's like you say, would you give your life for a kind of abstract principle? No, most people don't. They give their lives for something that defines their life, that is sort of, and it's usually personal. You give your, most people, if you ask them, what would you give your life for? It would be for their wife or their child or something, that's the kind of the level of meaning that's required. And I think if you don't have a sense of the personal meaning embodied in Christ and his way and his call and his kingdom, you'll struggle to make that the kind of thing that absolutely becomes life or death for you in the end. And it was for the people who gave us the culture we enjoy. This was a life or death matter. People went to their death for the sake of this truth. So I'd agree with all that. All I'd say is, having said all that, I still welcome the fact that you've got the Jordan Petersons and others who maybe it's difficult to determine what level this faith comes out at for them, because I think in an odd way, the very fact that they haven't quite jumped in, that they're still sort of on the outside to some extent of the church, is part of the reason they're so attractive to so many people.
That's why they say Jordan Peterson is the gateway drug to religion. I loved that. It was the perfect description.
And likewise, and Tom Holland, again, wherever he is himself personally is perhaps an open question. But I think the fact that people don't think of him as kind of being an insider on the Christian church kind of makes him people a lot more open to listening to him from outside the church. If he was already kind of sold up and inside, I think a lot of people think, oh, well, he's just another person, hawking that. So I think, as a Christian, my view is actually that God is using these people as sort of prophets from outside the church, in a kind of interesting and useful way. Of course, I want them to become, serious, sold out Christians. And who knows, maybe that will happen in time. All I know is that, as I said earlier, they are these gateway drugs for other people to start taking Christianity very seriously. I just encourage anyone who's in that position, though, of seeing the value of Christianity. I'd say that's not the end of the story. Keep pulling on that thread, and you'll find actually there's a real living person at the end of that you can get to know as well.
Well, and Tom, it's funny. I have to say, probably if I were to list my top 3 sort of like interviews or whatever that I've watched that affected me profoundly, Tom Holland's interview on your show is probably up there in my top most influential. For multiple reasons. I'm a huge fan of Tom. But one of the things that in his story that he talks about with the history of Christianity is this idea of what the early Christians were doing. They were proclaiming that this slave who had died this death on a cross had risen from the dead. That's the central Christian claim, right? And I in a way have thought about it as what Christians are, is we're people. It's like we've become convinced that he actually walked out of that tomb. And the issue is that I kind of tell people sometimes, imagine there's like a security camera and you got to see it, and he walked out, and that's all that you know. You just go, oh my gosh, like he walked out of the tomb. Like, what does this mean? Like it reorients everything. It reorients the whole story, everything. Because now you're trying to figure out, what does that even mean? Jordan Peterson has said, like, in fact, I think it was the best thing. Alex O'Connor asked him exactly the right question, because I think this is how you get away from sort of the vague spiritualism and the new agey Christianity, where it's kind of like, oh, it's just a useful fiction. There's a question. Did he walk out of that tomb? And if he did, that changes everything. That is, now you have to deal with that reality. And it's a binary question. He did or he didn't. And I think that Tom, what he does is he shows what happened to the people who thought that he did. And they revolutionized the world. And that is that means something. Now, there are those, though, that will listen to this story, and we're talking about these Christian values that are at the root of our Western society. They listen to Tom Holland and that kind of stuff, but they go, they ask the question, but are these really like these aren't unique to Christianity? Are you not saying that the Buddhists, they love each other too, and other people? You guys are trying to say these are Christian values when they're really universal human values. What would be your response to that sort of a criticism of Tom?
Well, honestly, I would let Tom do the responding, because this exact question came up when in his debate with AC Grayling on my show, and it's a must watch, show. It's out on YouTube, easy to find. Tom Holland versus AC Grayling, and yeah, AC Grayling basically says, look, yes, we have these values in all kinds of other cultures. It's not unique to Christianity. It's just ultimately it goes back to being human, And Tom Holland really takes him to the woodshed on this, because he points out all kinds of specific ideas and values that really are unique to Christendom, to Christian culture, and points out the fact that while obviously there's been a kind of quid pro quo that's existed across all times and cultures and places, the Greeks, the Romans, the great ancient cultures, they never had this idea that was really birthed with Christianity, which is this idea of that the weak and the powerless should triumph over the powerful and the successful, and so on. And yet this idea is baked into the very beginning of Christianity, because it's all about a God who chose to become powerless and was the victim at the hands of the Roman overlords. And this was the symbol, this was the cross was the symbol that Christians made the center of their movement from day one, and which fired this extraordinarily countercultural revolutionary idea that everyone had equal value in the eyes of God. What Paul says in Galatians about now there is neither slave nor free, male nor female, Jew nor Greek, for all are one in Christ Jesus, is absolutely extraordinary in that culture. No one was saying that in that culture. There was no pre-existent equivalent of that kind of language. So I just think it's just a fact that Christianity said radically new things about humanity that we now all accept by and large in the West, and you simply will struggle to find equivalents in other ancient cultures. I'm not saying other ancient cultures don't have moral frameworks and things, but they don't have this idea of the intrinsic dignity and equality of humans, apart from, I would say, the the Jewish tradition. But of course Christianity is a continuation of that tradition. But what it did was it globalized that idea. It kind of made it worldwide through Jesus. So that for me is really important to say there is something very historically unique about the values that Christianity birthed, which you simply will struggle to find in other cultures. And again, the thing that Tom used, it was quite fun in this debate he had with AC Grayling, to kind of just point this out to Grayling, who is a humanist, and essentially says, well, we all ultimately, all societies kind of gravitate towards these humanistic values. And Tom pulled out a whole list of all the places in the world where the humanist conferences had occurred, and with the exception of one, the last 50 humanist conferences had taken place in essentially Christian countries, or Christians, countries that have Christian heritage. And he says that's not an accident, Anthony. Yeah. There's a reason why your humanism is basically just a godless form of Protestant Christianity. Basically, that's what it is. And there's a reason why these conferences and humanism hasn't taken off, as an idea in Muslim majority countries, or China or wherever, and why the conferences don't happen there. It's because those aren't the cultures that bred this, So I just think, it's just, I think it's very hard to argue with Tom's kind of historical analysis there.
And I think that you absolutely can find partial sort of portions of Christian values and these things out there in the world. I'm not saying that other people have moral truth that they hold on to and have discovered and find valuable. Like, absolutely. I think the real difference, in addition to the things that you're talking about, is the Christian story grounds them in this really powerful way. And it seems to totalize these into a coherent sort of worldview that makes sense of all of these values in a greater story that others can't do in the same way. And so they point to a source of these values in a way that I think is unique and powerful, that other traditions or secular humanism, I mean, I'm sorry, I kind of laugh about secular humanism because it starts with the presupposition that human beings are all inherent and have all this value and stuff. And I'm just like, you didn't get that anywhere except like Christianity is what birthed that, you guys. Like, please, like, can we just, the very foundation of it is coming from the story of Jesus Christ and the way that that affected the world, and it's historically contingent, and it has a
and I think actually that the atheists and the sort of secular thinkers, at least, who are kind of are most honest about this are people like Yuval Noah Harari, who says, you know, famously in a TED talk a couple of years ago, said, cut open a human being, where will you find these human rights? You're not going to find it in the DNA, in the organs, in the material stuff of a human being. He said very specifically, your idea of human rights comes from a story. It comes from a religious story. It's not. So I find that actually there are some of these secular thinkers who are quite willing, you know, but when he says that, everyone stands up and says, oh, that you're not, that's sort of, they're a bit shocked at this idea. But I think Yuval Noah Harari is just pointing out the obvious, the kind of same thing that Tom Holland is pointing out. And AC Grayling, I think, as Tom Holland has said, is kind of invested in actually quite a theological understanding of humans. This idea that we all have intrinsic value and dignity, but there's no scientific, you know, material basis for that. It's very difficult to see how you would ever come up with a story that grounds it. That's you know, just comes out of naturalism. Basically, it has to come from something transcendent, and that's really what the Christian story gave it.
So there's something in your book that, as we kind of wind down on time here, we get into some of the final things to talk about. And this, I think, is the real game changer. I think that the change in the orientation towards God comes to something more personal, more direct, that people find as they look at themselves and they look around at society. I'm going to put up on the screen here for a minute a quote from your book. Let me just pull this up here. You say in the book, so we find ourselves in the modern 21st century. The Christian narrative of the past that once gave people a sense of common purpose and their place in the created order has been overthrown or forgotten. Now a, quote, be whatever you want to be culture is in ascendancy as people search for their, quote, true inner identity, their, quote, authentic self. This phenomenon is known as expressive individualism, and you talk about other philosophers who say describe our era as the, quote, age of authenticity. This part of the book, you start to talk about this meaning crisis that we're facing right now. You want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I think it is sort of summarized with this idea that we live in this age of self-invention. And I think a lot of people have assumed that throwing off a kind of traditional story like Christianity kind of emancipates people, makes them free to, as you say, be whoever you want to be. That's the kind of the call of the modern kind of millennial Gen Z kind of generation, isn't it? I think in reality, though, is that is incredibly difficult to do, because I don't think ultimately we were designed to live in a kind of make your own adventure kind of story or create your own identity kind of world, because it's incredibly difficult. It's burdensome, exhausting for people to do that, especially in a world that's demanding for you to do it constantly in the gaze of other people online, on social media. And that's why I think the meaning crisis is kind of being compounded by a mental health crisis among young people, because there's this extraordinary expectation and burden on young people to self-invent, basically. And I think that when you do kind of conceive of yourself as this kind of completely free individual, untethered to any tradition or story, just kind of, you can do whatever you want, grab onto whatever philosophy, ideology, identity you want. It's actually very confusing, and it's actually kind of debilitating, I think, for a lot of people. And the problem is that the more we go in this direction, not only does it have that effect on individuals, culturally speaking, it just means that you have a lot of very different stories all bumping up against each other and creating the culture wars. And so this is kind of where I see this meaning crisis kind of coming to its hardest point, is that as we've lost the Christian story, it's left this void. And I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said, when people stop believing in God, they don't thereafter believe in nothing. They have the capacity to believe in anything. And I think that's what we're seeing in our culture. The God story wasn't replaced by, science and reason, as the new atheists, I think, rather naively assumed it would be. It's been replaced by all kinds of other quasi-religious stories, because we still need a story to make sense of our life. But the stories we're grabbing onto now, whether it be the kind of ones on the progressive left around gender and identity, and that kind of becomes someone's sacred story, their unquestioned truth, if you like, or on the, political right, mythologies around, savior figures in America, naming no names. But there's a kind of sense of, that's just another story. It's a kind of another quasi-religious story that people are investing their life in. But all these stories are competing with each other, and they're all pulling in different directions, creating these culture wars, creating this very divided, polarized culture, which again is just accelerating this meaning crisis. And it's no surprise to me that we see, even in our very advanced, prosperous, arguably Western world, we're seeing the absolute rise in these mental health statistics among young people, suicide among men at its highest that it's been at any point recorded before. People filling in polls saying they don't have any sense of meaning or purpose in life. And for me, this is all part of this kind of self-invention world we live in, but which isn't working out for anyone. It's really pulling everyone down. And for me, this is what a lot of these psychologists like Jordan Peterson and others are stepping into and saying, hey, we need a better story to make sense of our lives. And this is why I think we're seeing the conditions emerge for people to start to take the Christian story seriously again, because it's being advocated for on the basis that it's a far better story to invest your life in than the ones we're trying to make sense of life with at the moment. And I just wonder if it has to get that bad, if you like. We have to feel the pinch of the meaning crisis before people suddenly wake up to the fact this funny old story that my grandparents or great-grandparents possibly believed in might just have something to say to me after all. And I think we're kind of getting to that, as we said earlier, turning of the tide moment, where it feels like maybe people are just getting ready to hear it again.
Absolutely. And I think it's funny, I would go even maybe a step further than saying that it isn't hard to create your own sort of story and meaning that gives your life purpose. I actually think it's impossible. And I think it's for a very particular reason. If you try and create your own story in this era of self-invention and my authentic self and all that kind of stuff, the problem is that everyone has to base their life on something. There has to be some fundamental value or something that is as Jordan Peterson would say, at the peak of your hierarchy of values. What's at the top of it? Functionally speaking, that is your God. That is the thing that orients you in matters of ultimate concern. Okay. And that's universal to all human beings. We all have to deal with that. And so the question is, what are you going to put there? That's where you place your faith, as it were. And if you put anything that's not transcendent in that place, let's say I put my career there. Well, what happens when I lose my job? What if I'll put my family there? What happens when I get divorced or there's some horrible accident and I lose my child? Or you have to find something. Jesus. And it's funny. Then you go read these scriptural stories and you hear him say, if you build upon my rock, when the winds come and the rains fall, you won't fall. And there's a peace that passeth all understanding. These sorts of ideas, when people hear the Christian story, it speaks to their soul. And I think what we're doing now, to kind of sum up what you're saying, is we're living in this world that really is paganistic. Because what was the pagan world but people creating their own gods to suit their own needs in the moment? Well, what are people doing now? You're just creating your own story that you're inventing that has nothing to do with the actual order of reality itself. That's a useful fiction for you to achieve your purposes. And that just, it can't be sustained. And it creates, you said, all the conflict that we see. And in my mind, what's happening, what's being hit, is that's hitting people not in a just intellectual way. It's hitting them in their day-to-day life. And I think that is that's the gravity at play.
Yeah.
That's
I'd agree with
causing the
that.
shift in the
Yeah,
tide.
I'd definitely say it's far more than just an intellectual thing going on at this point. I think the new atheist thing was essentially an intellectual kind of argument, but I think what's happened, the difference is now is that it's affecting people's lives, and the culture that we're currently kind of all being encouraged to be part of. People are saying it doesn't make sense for me anymore. I'm not. I can't live this way any longer. And like you say, sometimes it's a lot of external factors that sort of influence that. I think, for instance, the COVID pandemic, the threat of war on the shores of Europe, in Ukraine, lots of things have kind of destabilized people and made them realize actually just how little control they have actually about things. And that in itself, I think, can often be, again, circumstances that propel people towards something that does have real gravity and a foundation, and is the rock, that they can build their life on. Because people realize, all these other things, they're impermanent, and the gods that I've created for myself are going to let me down. I think Calvin said the human heart is a perpetual idol factory, and that's just still true. We are,
Yes.
as I said earlier, we're as religious as they were, and we're just as prone to put our faith in religious idols as any of the ancients were. So I think, but it feels like we're reaching a sort of something of a tipping point in our culture where people, as I say, those stories, those idols are kind of, we're running out of runway now with whether they can actually sustain us. The delusions, if you like, of our age are kind of running out of steam in that way.
Yeah. I'm going to share one other quote from your book as we kind of get to the very end here. You said, quote, Graham Tomlin, the Bishop of Kensington and the author of the book, Why Being Yourself is a Bad Idea, writes, in the West, we have largely lost our belief in God or any sense of a given cosmic order. As a result, there is no longer any overarching sacred structure that holds the world together. We are left on our own as individuals in a world without any predetermined order that tells us who we are in that world, or that gives us a sense of security and fit within a wider scheme of things. And then you say, this is the great irony of our age. We live in a more materially prosperous time than any other. Life expectancy is at an all-time high. We have a constant and ubiquitous access to the kind of technology that our ancestors would have considered nothing short of magical. Yet statistics tell us that we are more unhappy than we have ever been. And that's especially true of young people. That's a powerful thing. And I think, as you said, people are beginning to realize that the idols won't save them. That and I think this is maybe what Christians need to realize is I think there's that power in proclaiming he rose, like he walked out of the tomb.
Yeah, I think so. And
it counters the idol.
Yeah. And I've seen it, interestingly, as we bring this into the land, actually a growth in that Christian confidence, especially among a lot of the young Christians I encounter, who are kind of aware that all their contemporaries and friends are kind of wallowing in sort of this kind of confusion, really. And so they've kind of been emboldened actually to just be very upfront about their Christian faith, and to say, look, I know this sounds crazy in the modern world, this idea that a dead man came back to life, but I believe it's true. And I believe it makes all the difference, as you were saying earlier. And I think we kind of get to that point actually where, at some point you just have to tell the story again, and hope and pray that people are ready to hear it. Jesus often told stories, and he said, let those who have ears to hear. And he talked in his age about the fields being white unto harvest. And I think we're kind of reaching one of those moments again in the West where there are now people with ears to hear. There are now fields ready to be harvested, because we get to these tipping points, I think, in our culture. And as I say, as the road has run out on this idea of, be who you want to be culture, I think people are ready to hear, actually, there's a better story, a true story, even as strange as it may sound to our secular ears, it's a story that did completely shape our forebears, and that actually, when you actually go and investigate it, it kind of makes a lot of sense when you look into it.
Absolutely. Well, this has been great, Justin. I've really appreciated having you on. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap this up?
Only to say I've really enjoyed the conversation, and really appreciate the fact that I understand you're a Latter-day Saint, and so we've got our differences when it comes to sort of the specifics of Christianity. But I'm really glad to hear that you sense that there's a turning of the tide as much as I do, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. So thank you very much for it.
Awesome. Well, it's been great to have you on, and I hope we can do this again sometime.
Me too.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button so my future videos show up on your feed. Also, if you or someone that you know has benefited from the content here on Thoughtful Faith, please consider becoming a channel donor or volunteer by visiting my new website, thoughtfulfaith.org, and clicking on the Get Involved page.